Hey guys, it's Ben with Design 3, and today I'm talking to Derek Yu of Mossmouth. How you doing today, Derek?
Good.
What are some of the first video games you started playing, and what are some of your all-time favorites?
I actually started playing games like really early, basically as soon as possible, because my mom and dad owned an Atari 2600 before I was born, and my dad actually bought it for her because she was pregnant with me and she couldn't really leave the house. So basically, I popped out and there was the Atari right there. And on the Atari, I really liked Demon Attack. That was a fun game. We had the terrible Indiana Jones game for Atari. Right. There's stuff like Combat. I mean, they're all really cool, but I think it wasn't really until I started playing PC games and the NES that I really found my games, which I'd call my favorites. I remember on PC, my parents had these floppy disks that had tons of games that I guess they got in grad school. They had stuff like Colossal Cave Adventure. These are like old DOS games, and Hack. So Hack and roguelikes ended up being, a big influence on Spelunky eventually. And I remember Hack was just one of it was like the gem of that collection of floppy disks with all those games. Right. And they were all unlabeled, so I would just go through and hunt for stuff. When I first played Nintendo, though, yeah, that's when I really was just blown away by video games. So, yeah, some of my favorites are definitely The Legend of Zelda 1. I mean, I think that's a favorite of a lot of, especially the indie guys. But yeah, I just remember spending hours just poring over the instruction manual to the game and looking at all the little pictures and imagining all the things happening. And my dad and I would actually make maps for the game. We'd play together and he'd make maps while I played. So, I'd be in a dungeon and I'd go to the next room and then he'd draw in what was going on. So I think playing with my dad and that being something that we spent a lot of time doing together was, I think helps make that one of my favorite games of all time. Other than Zelda, I really like Doom, Street Fighter 2, and I would say Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Those are all games where, when I first started playing them, they really just kind of expanded my mind. I would feel like they really blew open another kind of door for me, and I spent so much time thinking about all of those games. Yeah, I don't know. My friends and I would just talk about them constantly and just theorize and make up all kinds of stuff, and they're all just fantastic games. And they got great designs, so yeah.
Do you have an all-time favorite game character? Could you pick one?
It's tough. I'd actually probably pick Doom Guy, the Doom Space Marine. I don't know. He doesn't say a lot. I kind of like that. It was back in a time when Space Marines didn't have voices, right. But he was, he's this constant. His head, is constantly on the screen looking at you, and I just thought it was I actually just think it's a really cool design. It's kind of campy, but his face, getting bloodier and grunting and looking back and forth, it really added a lot of immersion to the game. Actually, I just like the design of his suit, and I've seen that character die so many times, playing deathmatch with my friends and stuff, and I've done lots of fan art, drawing the Doom Guy and stuff like that, and I don't know. I think I would pick him, either him or Dudley from Street Fighter 3. He's like the dapper, gentleman boxer, and he's kind of become my main fighting game character. I'm not that good at fighting games, but I used to play Ken in Street Fighter 2, but then once Street Fighter 3 came out, and then mostly Street Fighter 4, Super Street Fighter 4, I started playing Dudley, and I don't know, with a lot of games, even like my favorite ones like Mario and Zelda and stuff like that. I mean, I'm obviously very attached to the characters, but there's something about fighting games where I think you have to select a character. You're not just kind of forced to be that character. And I feel like to select a character in a fighting game, you're not only, you have to think so much about everything, right? Like, because it's, you know, not just who the character is, but how he fights and your own play style. You have to think a lot about yourself and how you like to play. So, you know, I mean, I think with Dudley, it kind of helped me realize that I do like playing like very aggressively and kind of recklessly, and I like his character, his persona, and he's a very interesting guy. I like his Rose taunt and all that stuff.
Yeah, it makes me remember playing fighting games as a kid where each person like had their character.
Yeah.
And they had like knew all the best moves.
Yeah.
And everybody get like angry at each other because they like used it like exploit moves, you know?
Yeah.
Like in Street Fighter, I was Chun-Li all the time.
Sure.
Cause like bounce off the wall and then do that leg kick just like nonstop. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's kind of interesting how like with fighting games, especially like what you were saying, you pick that character and you kind of almost become them, you know, when you play that game.
You do, and you know, you're talking to your friends about it, and you know, you're referring to yourself like as that character and stuff like that, and you like, you know, you watch like the professional players, and you like the ones that play your character, and you're excited to see what they can do with them. So, yeah, I think in fighting games the characters are extremely important. So, yeah.
Do you have maybe a favorite video game soundtrack, you know, like a music score that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I don't listen to a lot of video game music outside of video games, outside of playing the games. So, you know, definitely the standard stuff, like the Zelda overworld theme and you know, the Super Mario theme song are very recognizable. I love Bloody Tears though from Castlevania. It's kind of like I think it was introduced in Simon's Quest, the second one. But yeah, I really like that song. I like all the covers, especially the really like, you know, guitar-based ones. I was thinking though, and I think like if I were to pick a game like in the entire soundtrack, I might honestly go with F-Zero.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know. I love the Mute City theme, and the whole soundtrack is just, I think, pretty solid.
It added a lot to that game too, I felt like.
It does. I mean, you think about the music and you just kind of imagine like this car just drifting along this this endless sort of neon highway. So I feel like if I don't know, if I were to pop a video game soundtrack into my car, it might be F-Zero.
That's cool. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about how you first got started in video game development?
Yeah, I mean, I started designing games pretty early on, I would say, just on paper. I had a group of friends in elementary school, and we were all really into Nintendo. And we were all really into video games. We shared a lot of like love for, you know, Nintendo and Doom and Street Fighter. I went to school with these guys, you know, for a pretty long time. And one of those friends, John Perry, was actually interested in developing them too. Because, you know, we were all interested in playing them, but you don't, or at least, you know, back then I didn't meet a lot of people who were actually interested in designing them with me. So John was one of those people, and we would go to each other's houses and we would just draw like video game levels, and we talk about, you know, characters. We even invented our own game systems and stuff like that. So that was kind of the precursor, I guess. But I didn't start developing them until later, and I guess I started by fooling around with like some QBasic stuff. I made some text adventures, but yeah, it wasn't really until Click and Play, the Click and Play program, came out that I think that we started making games like really seriously. So I think I got the first copy of Click and Play. I asked my parents to get it for me, and then John would come over and we'd both use it and just basically take turns programming or doing the scripting and drawing graphics and stuff like that. So the first game I made with it, I remember, the first game I finished with Click and Play was this game called Trigger Happy, and I actually made that mostly on my own. But when I was done with it, I put it on AOL. And I don't even remember how that works exactly. Like, how do you put a game on AOL? Like,
I was just gonna ask you that. How do you put a game on AOL?
They just had a games section, and you could upload stuff. But I remember I finished this game. It was just like a top-down deathmatch shooter, basically. Or you controlled these little army men, and you'd collect various weapons, and you'd shoot at each other, and there'd be traps and stuff like that. But I released that on AOL, and I remember getting emails or instant messages or whatever, AOL messages from people who'd played the game, and they were like, "Oh, this is really cool. I really enjoyed it," and it was such a good feeling, especially to be a kid and to just get like letters from strangers basically telling you like that they played your game and they really liked it, and when you're coming out with more and stuff like that. So. That's basically, at that point I was basically hooked on making the games, and a pretty small but close-knit community ended up sprouting up like around Click and Play, and it actually still exists. So I do check back on it every now and then and see what people are up to. But I ended up being pretty entrenched in that community, and we would just make games and share them with each other there and stuff like that. So yeah.
That's great. How did you kind of learn the skills you needed to start making those games, like programming skills or art skills or any of the necessary skills?
Right. So Click and Play, I mean, there's a lot of drag and drop stuff, and it's very basic scripting that you're doing. So so it made it really easy to make games, and I think it came with like a built-in image editor that you'd use to do artwork. So, I basically learned how to do video game sprites, at least just with Click and Play, and learning kind of the fundamental logic of making games, if not programming per se, right? Because it's very, very high level stuff, but it definitely, I think the good thing about Click and Play is that it let me do so many different aspects of the game so easily that you're not spending all of your time focused on learning programming first, and then you got to make time for artwork. You can kind of do all of these things at once and see all the pieces fit together. So I think it was really important, especially for someone who's kind of a generalist like me, where I do enjoy programming. Art is, I would say, my main skill, I guess. Yeah. But I do enjoy programming, and it's something that I would have a hard time giving up completely when making a game. So I think Click and Play, that series of software was really helpful in helping me build everything up at once. And then later I went to school, I went to college and studied programming a lot more seriously, right? And that kind of helped me pick up my lacking programming knowledge. And the art, I really have just been self-teaching myself. And with art, it was something that I always enjoyed doing, and that always came naturally for me, as opposed to the programming. So it was much easier for me to just find communities online, find art forms, seek out other artists. I'm pretty proactive about finding other people who have the same interests, and I think that's been a big benefit I mean, it started, yeah, like the click and play community. That was, getting involved in that, and then with art, getting involved in various art forums and stuff like that, and putting my art out there and seeing what other people are doing and studying their work and stuff like that. And for the game design, like the design aspect, just making games and playing games and thinking about them, I think has been enough.
So how did you break into the video game industry? Like, what was your first job you got?
Oh, in the industry? Yeah. I mean, I was lucky that Aquaria was my first. Well, I guess that's not completely true. I did work for. I had a summer job when I was in school working for a friend of my dad's who made video games. Okay. I think he worked for my dad and then quit to actually make video games. Oh, excuse me. And he made like basically shareware. They're like shareware turn-based puzzle games. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's kind of interesting because one of them was like Explorer, kind of like an Indiana Jones themed thing, which I had never really thought about until now. But I did that for a summer, and then after college, I did a lot of freelance illustration, and some of that was, like maybe half of that was game involved. Okay. Where I would do concept art for, I don't know, Flash games and cell phone games, and I did some magazine stuff. But Aquaria was really my first real job in the industry. It was my first commercial game that I worked on, like seriously. And that was just dumb luck that I was able to get that, because I met Alec online. He was the other person that worked on that game, and I met him online, and it was a pretty chance encounter. Yeah. Where I was working on I'm OK, which was this game that was based on the Jack Thompson design. Like, he designed this like sick and twisted game, and we decided to. He was kind of daring somewhat people to make the game, and I was making it with some friends, some online friends, and Alec got involved through that. Alec got involved in that, and that's kind of how I met him. And that's when we started talking about Aquaria and stuff. So that was basically my first gig. It feels kind of like it was outside of the industry proper, because we were just releasing it digitally, and we didn't really have a lot of contact with the rest of the game industry while we were working on it. We were just working on it in our bedrooms, essentially, and we didn't really know that much about what was, we didn't have that much contact with the rest of the game industry until IGF, so yeah.
Can you walk us through like a typical day of work for yourself?
Sure. I mean, usually I wake up and it's afternoon. Usually it's around like 2 p.m. or something like that, I'd say, on average, when I'm working on a project. And I'll get up. The first thing I'll do is I will walk 5 steps to my computer, and I'll open Gmail, and I'll see if Andy Hull is online. He usually is. He lives on the East Coast. So he's 3 hours ahead, and he also wakes up earlier than I do. So usually I'll ping him, and I'll be like, "Morning." And he'll say morning. Andy's the guy that Andy is working with me on Spelunky. He's the other half of the XBLA version of Spelunky. And so I'll ping him, and then I'll put him on Google Video on my MacBook, and we'll just kind of chat and talk about if we got any emails about Spelunky, if there's any new Spelunky news, like, I don't know, if there's someone said something about it, or some like a preview or something like that went up about it, or if we got any emails from Microsoft or anyone else. And basically, I'll just spend a couple hours kind of talking with him and catching up on stuff and about what we're working on. We overlap for about maybe 8 hours during the day, and then there's another 8 hours or whatever, right, where where one of us is asleep. So we'll kind of catch up on those hours where we weren't together. I'll spend a couple hours doing that, then I'll go and get food. I don't think there's really a word. There's no name for that meal that I have at that point, because it's like kind of my breakfast, but it's also
Just during the day something.
yeah, exactly. So I'll go get something to eat, and I'll read a magazine or something. Then I'll come back, and it's not that exciting. I'll basically just work until Andy goes to bed, and then I'll keep working, and I usually hit a stride pretty late in the evening. By this point, like, my roommate has come home from work and he's gone to bed, and it's just me, and everything's really quiet, and I'll just work and burn the midnight oil or whatever until I go to sleep. And that's a typical work day. I'm just working.
What time would you say you normally go to bed? It's kind of a strange question, but I've started asking people, like, do you have a normal bedtime? Or
I do. It's usually around 4 a.m., but it goes from like 4 to 6 a.m. And then there are moments where, there are days where we have milestones and things like that. They're just stuff we need to get done, or I'm hitting like a really nice stride, and I'll just stay up till morning. There's that period where I have to where I'm starting to get hungry again, and I got to decide: do I wait till basically 7 or 8 a.m. when the breakfast restaurants and the cafes open, so I can go get some breakfast and get a tea or a donut or something like that. So I got to make that around like 6 a.m. I have to start making that very difficult decision as to whether I just go to bed or
go eat.
stay up and go eat. Yeah.
So can you tell us about the current project you're working on now?
Yeah, so I'm still working on Spelunky, the XBLA version of Spelunky. We are wrapping up. I feel like I can safely say we're finishing, basically. And so I don't know. It's exciting. We're tired and we're looking forward to the finish, but we're also getting to work on. I'm getting to work on a lot of the things that I like working on, which are some of the just itty bitty details that make the game really shine and the polish. We're nominated in IGF again this year. Spelunky is nominated for the first time, but Aquaria, my previous game, we were also nominated. So this is like the second time that I'm going to IGF, and we're really excited about that. The other guys on the team, Andy and Eric, our musician, have never been. So it's pretty cool. But I'm just kind of trying to balance the working on the game and promoting the game at this point, because it's coming towards the end, and so that's kind of it's a challenge for me, at least, because I really when I'm working on the game, I tend to get really focused on that, and it's hard for me to pull my head out and see what's going on in the outside world too much, and get out there and tell people about the game while I'm working on it is just not something that really comes naturally to me. So I'm trying to balance that, and we're basically just trying to finish, trying to set serious boundaries for ourselves as to what we can keep working on and what is splitting hairs at this point, basically. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a grind, but it's also exciting. Like we're getting to the finish. Yeah, the end of the marathon.
Yeah. How do you start a new game? You know, kind of like the designing, planning phase. How do you go about that?
So for me, I'm always thinking about other ideas, like while I'm working on my current project. It's just impossible not to think about other stuff. You come up with new ideas and think about them. You have to, I don't know, I have to play around with them in my head at least, even if I can't really work on them. And you know, I don't know, I just do little sketches and write things down. So, I mean, like with Spelunky, for example, by the time I'm finished, I'm gonna have ideas that I want to work on. And I don't know how many of them are actually viable. Like there's no way to tell until you actually start working on it. So basically, once I get started again, I'm going to just start trying to make some of these games, and I'll probably end up discarding a lot of ideas immediately. Like I'll start working on them, and I just won't feel it. I'll realize there's something that I hadn't considered when I was just, you know, playing around with the idea in my head. Some of them will get to a certain point before I realize that, and some of them will actually have all of the ingredients that I want to see in a game, that I want to spend my time on. Where, you know, they're not only good ideas, but they're ideas that are fun for me to work on, where I enjoy doing the art and the programming. I think that's really important because, you know, I'm very aware of kind of the middle stages of game development, the end stages of game development, where if you're not really into it, there's a good chance that it's going to be very tempting to quit, or at least you'll be put in a difficult spot where you've put in a lot of time into it, but if you're not feeling it, like it's just it's a tough choice you have to make, where you know, to scrap work. So I mean, for me these days, like I'm going to use Game Maker to start prototyping my ideas, because I find it to be a very intuitive program. And thus far, like a lot of the ideas I have, they can be implemented in Game Maker. I mean, Spelunky was made this way. Like it was made in Game Maker first, and this version, the XBLA version, I mean, we're programming it with C++ and Visual Studio and using, like, quote unquote serious development tools. But to get the idea of Spelunky to a stage where I could tell that it was a viable idea, and something that I also just really enjoy working on and cared about working on, you know, I used Game Maker. It was the exact same thing with you know, this process that I'm describing. It worked out this way with Aquaria too, where I did have some ideas that were brewing in my head while I was working on Aquaria, you know, and thankfully, like I've worked up the discipline by now to not actually, you know, just discard what I'm working on in favor of my new ideas.
From one to the other.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why I was able to develop that discipline was because I worked on these longer projects with other people, where, you know, you're kind of keeping each other afloat, and you're helping each other stay focused even while these other things are going on in your head. But you know, after Aquaria was done, I was basically ready to go, like to start working, and I didn't have Spelunky developed. You know, Spelunky wasn't an idea that was in my head, but I had ideas in my head that eventually led to Spelunky. So I'm a big proponent of just starting and not doing, I mean, working for me is planning in a way. I guess the real planning is just done in my head, but I don't do a lot of design document type stuff. I mean, I may do a little for fun, but the most fruitful planning, I guess I've ever done has just been trying to make games, doing prototypes, doing a lot of them, and then taking the successful parts from the discarded prototypes and having them and funneling them into the one that actually makes it. I mean, part of it is my personality. Like, I'm not a planner at all, and sometimes it gets me into trouble, but not with game development. Like, you know, there's some things, like, if you're giving a talk, like, you really should plan, and that's something that I've had to learn kind of the hard way. You know, because I've given talks at GDC, and they've been really difficult for me, and I just start rambling because I haven't prepared. Right. And part of it, I think, is because I like to just start, and I like to just start working, and I like to learn through working. I don't do well, like, just sitting and talking about stuff endlessly. Like, I need to start programming. I need to start drawing, stuff like that. Right. So for me, the early stages are already work, and that's something that's also, I think, only doable if you are working by yourself or with a really small group, because I totally see the importance of having design documents and discussions and stuff like that when you're working with a team, and you have to communicate with your team members about the idea. You can't just start doing stuff and, okay, you start doing stuff and then we'll just glue it together. Yeah, we'll see what happens. You can't do that. But I think that, you know, I think that's partly why I've been so drawn to the whole independent development, starting with the click and play scene and that kind of stuff, and, you know, moving on to Aquaria and Spelunky. It's the most natural way for me to work, you know, to at least get the project started by myself. Yeah.
So you mentioned Game Maker. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other software and, like, tools you use when you're making games?
Yeah, I mean, for Spelunky XBLA, we're using Visual Studio. That's like our main development environment. And that's about it for the programming side of things. I mean, we're using, like, some third-party software to like for music, we're using Audacity, and we're using various third-party software to handle some of the stuff like localization, things like that, like making fonts. Right. But most of my day is spent with Visual Studio and Photoshop. Okay. So all the artwork is done in Photoshop, and I do most of my art in general just in Photoshop, like, directly. I don't do a whole lot of pen on paper stuff anymore, you know, when it comes to concept art or illustrations that the game needs and stuff like that. I'm pretty much just using Photoshop. So other than that, I mean, yeah, that's the main stuff. I mean, I use Chrome to browse the internet and look up stuff.
Is there any kind of common design challenges you've run into through the course of the games you've made?
Yeah, I mean, every game has its own very unique design challenges, which is what makes game development so interesting. Like, you're always having to learn new stuff. And actually, I was talking to Andy recently. He was mentioning the Pixar. There's, like, a documentary about Pixar. He was saying that they were talking about how, like, they'll make a movie, they'll finish it, it'll be this huge pain in the ass, right? Like, a really hard work, and they'll feel like, okay, my next project, or our next movie is gonna be so much easier. It's gonna go so much more smoothly. There are all these snags we ran into with this one, but we've solved these problems.
Right.
The next one's gonna be so much easier, and then they'll realize that, okay, well, here's a whole new batch of problems that are, I think you always want to push yourself, and by pushing yourself, you're always stepping into unfamiliar territory. So,
Right.
in the Pixar example, with Pixar, Andy told me about some of the examples they had where, they'd do Toy Story, and then with A Bug's Life, all of a sudden they'd have to handle like 100 ants on the screen, and they wouldn't have the capability of doing that, or they'd have tons of grass and leaves and stuff like that are kind of translucent, so they'd have to figure out some technology to be able to render that and stuff like that. So they're all, with each game I feel like usually it's mostly new design challenges, but I would say fundamentally the main challenge that's common to all of these games is just getting across that kind of core vision to the player, and trying to with every aspect of the game, trying to convey that vision to them. I think ideally with any game you want to have a worldview, a philosophy to help you make the game, basically, and to give the player something that they can take away and that they can kind of understand. You're kind of going along this journey making the game, and I just like in real life, it's nice to have a certain worldview to help you make decisions and decide what you're going to do, like from day to day and in the long term. And it's the same with making a game. It's the same with you want to have that with you while you're making the game, and then you want the player to be able to play through your game with that same idea. So for me, a core vision or philosophy, it can be a number of different things. It can be something, it can be something very mechanical, like a certain mechanical system in the game, a set of rules that kind of permeates the entire game. Just something cool. I think the different genres that your game can be in are kind of describe that in a way. So you might just, your worldview might just be to make like a really cool platform game, that's very fast paced and has this and this, and that might be what informs you, or it could just be a feeling, something much more vague that's like a combination of different feelings that you want the player to experience, whether it's like excitement or anger or whatever, or it can be a word, exploration is kind of a very common word that I think people use to inform their game design and to kind of let the player know like what the game's all about. When you're actually when the player's actually playing the game, though, you don't want to just have a sign at the beginning of the game that tells them this is what the game is about. Like, this is what I was thinking when I was making the game. Ideally, it should be something that they feel, I guess, in every part of the game, and something they're directed by in the rules, within the rules of the system, basically. So that's in any game you make, and this has been my experience with Aquarius, and this has been my experience with Spelunky. The hardest part has been the the hardest design challenge has been, one, to figure out what is that core thing. What do we want this game to be? You know, I mean, and number two is how do we get this across to the player? And it kind of goes hand in hand where you're figuring out one and the other at the same time, which is what makes, which can make it challenging. And I think especially with independent game development, it goes hand in hand. I feel like with a large scale game that hundreds of people are working on, that you kind of want to nail some of the stuff down earlier on. Although I do feel like, from what I've heard, anecdotes that I've heard and interviews that I've read and stuff like that, that does happen in big game developments too. Like, they're still figuring this stuff out well into the game development after they've already done enough work to, like, release tons of games, right? So I think that's the hardest challenge. I don't think that there's a magic bullet to solve that problem. I mean, the journey of solving that problem, I think, is partly what informs the eventual solution, as kind of weirdly zen as that may sound. It's kind of like you have to go through that struggle figuring it out to like, it's key to the game's development. But I think if you've got a solid vision that's true to you, that feels good to you, and you let that permeate your every kind of decision in the game, I think you'll be okay.
What is your personal take on the whole indie development scene kind of culture as it is now?
Yeah, well, I've been pretty close to it for since I've been an indie game developer, partly because I also run the Independent Gaming Source, which is these days it's a fairly popular website for indie game development. It started off as just a news website that was just a blog on Blogspot that Jordan Magnuson ran, and he did a short interview with me for the site, but then ended up having to, after the interview was printed, he had to, for kind of personal and work reasons, I think, didn't have the time to run the site anymore, so I kind of took it over from him. And since then, it's developed into a lot of things. First and foremost is probably the forums, where people talk about everything from game development to just games. And also there's a independent game database that's kind of associated with the site. But in running that, between running that and making my own games, I feel like I've been like very close to the indie game scene, I guess you'd call it, and I think that has its pros and cons when it comes to talking about the indie game scene, because on the one hand, I'm so close to it that I got tunnel vision. On the other hand, I do have I feel like I've got a fairly intimate view of it. I've always been pretty optimistic about the indie game scene, and I've always I feel like the direction that it's been going has been really good. And I think the trajectory it's at now, I'm very happy with it. I'd like to see it to continue along that trajectory. The way I feel about it, is that I think indie games started becoming very popular based around the idea of community, of being able to share very personal visions and ideas with one another in kind of like an intimate way. And I think, for me, it goes back to the click and play scene where we made games, we released them, talked about them. Not that many people knew about most of these games outside of the small community. Every now and then you'd have like a game that kind of broke away from the community and was well known like outside of it, I guess. Much less so those days, but yeah, I think that idea of like this intimate crowd, and the indie spirit, that people have all kinds of different definitions for, right? But I think most of them kind of allude to this sort of intimate nature of the community. I think it started, in great part, it kind of started with that. And then once indie games started becoming more popular, and people started talking about them more, and more people started, this community started expanding and expanding. More people started making games as indies, either deciding to, making games on a small scale and deciding to kind of take a stab at it full time, or leaving big companies to form small companies and to work that way. I think the indie game scene, it has, for me at least, I feel like it's moved away from a little bit away from that very small and communal aspect to something that is just, it's more broad, and I think it's more informed by the industry as a whole. Yeah. And I think as a result, we're seeing a lot larger scale and more serious indie games getting released, and I think we're seeing a lot more, I guess, polish in the games, and kind of, and honestly, like professionalism amongst indie game developers. And I think the ideal thing for me is if we keep that kind of personal nature, the intimate nature of the development, and just just the honesty shared between, like, amongst indie game developers. I mean, a lot of the indie game guys I find it so admirable just how honest they are about everything. Yeah. And they speak from their heart, and it's great. And they make games, from their heart too. So ideally, I want to see indie game developers make games that, that compete on the level of big budget titles in every way. Yeah. Not just in the. I mean, I think there's a certain, there's with limited resources, there's a problem of scale, of course. Like, but I feel like even that is kind of, even that you can kind of break it down with a small team. You look at games like Dwarf Fortress, and the scale of that game, I think it dwarfs, no pun, okay, pun totally intended, the scale of a lot of mainstream games. It's just what Tarn and Zach have chosen to focus on, right? Like, they've chosen to eschew a lot of the like the graphics and the user interface part of the game to really focus on that. And I think, I think that game competes on the level of a lot of serious RPGs, like even stuff like Skyrim. And I think in a lot of ways it's even deeper. So yeah, I'm always interested in having the best of both worlds and kind of like eating my cake and having my ice cream too. And I feel like with indie game development, you can do that. If you mix in the kind of, if you mix in discipline and professionalism and dedication with a kind of, I guess, with these personal visions that people have, and I don't know. I think you can make stuff that is not only really just pure, but it can also they can also just be like tremendously good and important games.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's something that only indie developers can do, but I feel like a lot of my favorite games were made by small teams, like Doom, for example. I mean, you read about their development and it sounds very indie,
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a bunch of guys who were just extremely talented, but they had a unique vision, and I don't think that could have been diluted, I think, with if they weren't such a small and intimate group of guys.
Yeah.
So, I love the spontaneity of the indie game community. I love the game jams and the spontaneous competitions. I want to have more of those competitions on TigSource and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think it'd be great if we could have kind of all of it. I like seeing the game jams, and I like seeing these kind of small experimental games and people's just crazy ass prototypes and stuff like that. I also like seeing indie games that are just strong commercial successes and which are just strong games all the way around. Like full big meaty games from small teams.
Could you talk a little bit about how you manage your time and stay on track with everything you need to do?
Yeah, I've always been pretty good about getting my games done. And so I feel like I've got a reasonable handle on that.
Right.
I don't consider myself actually to be the most disciplined person, but when it comes to making games, I feel like I'm getting that part sorted.
Right.
And so I even wrote an article called "Finishing a Game" that talks about how what I think about when I'm trying to finish. But the important thing for me is that I'm always moving forward. I really try not to get bogged down by some kind of nitty-gritty thing. And I think that's been a strength when working on games. And I've noticed that it's a trap that game developers fall into a lot. Is just they'll get hung up on something too early on in the development. Like, it could be some technical detail of the game engine that they're working on, that they, want to get perfect before they even start putting any content in. So I really feel like the content of, I really feel like every aspect of the game I want to, build up at the same time. And, I want to save a lot of the really nitty-gritty details for later. You know, my first instinct is to get a working solution, not get the best solution.
Right.
And for me, I think it partly works in my favor that I'm not a phenomenal programmer by any means. So I actually cannot, you know, my first inclination is not going to be to try to do something clever, at least with the programming. It's going to be to do a brute force thing. Thankfully, I think that happens to be the way to do it, because I've actually heard people who are really good programmers say similar things. Like, I think I read somewhere, I'm not sure if it was like in Masters of Doom or a tweet or something like that, but I've heard John Carmack actually talk about him implementing things in just just finding a working solution for a difficult problem, and
Right.
just trying to see if that first idea that he has works. And then once he gets it working, he can kind of think about optimizing it and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, obviously he's working on much more difficult programming problems than me, but I think it applies no matter what you're doing.
Right.
So not getting hung up is a big thing, and you know, if I'm having a problem with one part of the game, like I will move on to something else, and then I'll come back, and you know, I'll get stuff working, and then I'll come back and I'll improve it, you know, later if I can. And I think you just have to constantly be pushing forward toward that end goal,
Right.
and you have to reach that end goal a few times and practice finishing your game. I mean, that's something that I feel like I really want to drive home to people starting out, people who haven't finished a game yet. I want to drive home the idea that it's important to finish. I like to think of it as not just a step in the development process, but it's actually like a skill and a
Yeah.
talent
Yeah.
that you can develop, and that some people are naturally better at than others. So it's kind of like running a marathon or something like that, or like any kind of long race, where you can't just run the first half of a race over and over again and call yourself like a successful
Expect anything.
runner, because there's so much that happens in that second half of the development that
Right.
I mean, I think people just do not realize, and even people who have released games, they underestimate over and over again how hard that last part of development is. And part of it is because you're tired, you're burnt out.
Right.
Part of it is there's a lot of just boring grind in the middle you got to get through, and you got to put yourself in the right place. I mean, going back to the racing analogy, like if you haven't trained properly and you haven't run a bunch of races, like you're just not gonna have the stamina to push through that last part,
Yeah.
right? Like at that point, you're kind of on autopilot. You kind of just have to push it through.
Right.
So when working on games, I definitely think a lot about that process and about putting myself in a good position for the last half of the development. And it's long, and it always goes longer than people think. That's why games get pushed back all the time, like their release dates and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, to manage in terms of time management, I mean, you have to put like a certain ridiculous number of hours into your game to finish it.
Yeah.
And like you just have to put in that time, and I think most game developers are working like all the time,
Yeah.
And they're doing it because they care about the project and enjoy it, hopefully. I mean, that's the case for me. Like it's addictive. It's enjoyable, that creative process. You lose track of time while you're working on it. So I think the key to managing that time properly is to just making sure you're working on stuff at the right points in the development.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can think of it like, oh, well, all this stuff has to get done anyways. What does it matter if I work on this part now as opposed to later? But, you know, it's kind of, you know, what you put in first into the game. I mean, you know, the next thing is going to kind of build on top of that, and yeah, you just want to work efficiently, basically.
Right.
And for me, that's always moving on to like the next big point in the game design, or you know, in the content. Like I work on the content along with the design and the programming and stuff like that. Like I work on art assets and stuff like that, but I try to hit those big points as soon as possible, and I try to leave the smaller points for later. You know, I definitely try to make sure that I don't get hung up on a little point when there are, you know, however many big points.
To deal with.
Yeah, to think about first.
Yeah. So Spelunky features randomly generated levels, which kind of fundamentally changes the concept of level design.
Yeah.
How do you approach level design when you have randomly generated levels in your game?
Yeah, it's difficult. Definitely making random levels is very fun for the developer. So it's, in that sense, it's easy because you know, you get to design algorithms, and then you get to see what comes out of it. It's a lot like mad science in a way, where, you know, you make a little change here and it has far-reaching consequences to the levels, to the way, you know, what happens when the levels actually get generated. With Spelunky, with any randomly generated game, it's not going to be completely random, right? So with Spelunky specifically, like, the levels are built out of rooms that are designed by hand in a lot of ways. They have small random bits like within a specific room, but for the most part, like, I'm designing that one room by hand, you know, and the thing that I have to think about that's different than if you're just making like a regular, like a static level, is that when I'm designing this room, I have to think about how it's going to fit together with all the other rooms.
Right.
So there's a lot of trial and error. You have to look at all the different configurations that come out of your algorithms and see and kind of get a sense for what is coming out. It's random every time, but there's still, like, you know, generally certain types of levels will come out with you know, there are exceptions for sure, but you do want to think about a sort of average level, an average experience. It can't be completely random, or I mean, the player is going to feel it. They're going to feel like they're just playing something that's completely random, and that's not always what you want. And you have to design the mechanics of the game have to work well with the randomization too.
Yeah.
So, you know, certain types of games are gonna, and certain types of mechanics are gonna work better with random level generation. You have to think about that. You know, I don't think every game should have random level generation.
Certain games.
Right. I'm sure you could design some interesting algorithms that make some fun, like Sonic the Hedgehog levels or something. Right. But in general, it's, you know, for that type of game, maybe it's better to just design it all by hand. So for Spelunky, you have a lot of tools that help you not just like deal with the random generation and the type of stuff that can come up, but I think it actually works hand in hand. Things like the bomb, the fact that the terrain is destructible, I think is really important to the random level generation because, I mean, in Spelunky, I think one of the core ideas is just the fact that you have a lot of freedom and you have a lot of options, and the random levels are always putting you on your toes and forcing you to consider all of those different options and what you want to do. It's very free form, and the solutions are the quote unquote solutions to the game are very organic. Right. So it's never just a case of I try to minimize the number of cases where it's just like, oh, it's this situation again. I'm going to do this exactly the same way. Yeah. I mean, you may come up with strategies that work. If you're going to try to rob a shop in the game, for example, you may find that, well, chucking a bomb in there that's the way I like to do it. I'm kind of getting good at timing the bomb so that it explodes right on top of the shopkeeper and he doesn't get out of the shop. But then, because of the random level generation and the way things work in the game, I think it's a much more subtle. I think there are a lot of subtleties when you decide you're going to bomb out a shop or something. There are other factors that play into it. So it's not just putting a bomb in this one place every time and doing the exact same thing. The right. repercussions are going to be slightly different. Yeah. And with everything in Spelunky, I try to design it on a fairly fundamental level. Another important thing that I thought about when I was working on the game was I wanted to make sure that if you can do something to, like for example, if you can pick up a rock, it's important that you can also pick up a caveman. Okay. Like, I want monsters and I want inanimate objects to, on a fundamental level, work fairly similarly. It's not coming here, so I think we're safe. And I think that kind of, I mean, that was something I thought about when I was designing the algorithms that are behind the levels. So I don't know. There are a lot of different ideas. I guess the important ones are one, the levels are, there is a certain handmade aspect to the level generation. I mean, you can think of it like piecing handmade rooms together. Two, there are other aspects of the game that make the generation work, like that make it interesting. I think random level generation is always going to be interesting for the player just because there's like that newness that you can look forward to. But I think if you really want to make it work, you have to think about all the other different parts of the game that are going to make it work. You have to think about stuff as minute as like the I don't know if it's minute, but you have to think about how high the player can jump. I mean, in Spelunky you can jump 2 tiles high and grab onto a ledge and pull yourself up. So that's important to the level design. I've got to make sure that the randomly generated levels take that into account, and I want to make sure that there's a path through every level that doesn't require bombs. That was something that was a decision that I had to make because I wanted to minimize the chance that the player is going to get stuck somewhere, and it not be his fault. Like he or she, like I don't want the player to be scared of using bombs because they feel like somewhere along the road they're randomly just going to get stuck.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things you have to consider with the randomized levels. You are immediately getting some good stuff in terms of the newness, the freshness that players are going to be attracted to. I mean, it's going to be fun for them to see a new level every time. But to make it deeper, to make it really last, you have to think about these other things too.
So you released Spelunky, the first version for PC in 2008, and now you're working on a version for Xbox Live Arcade.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition, from one platform to the other?
Yeah. I mean, it's not really it's not a port at all. We wrote the engine from scratch.
Yeah.
Even if there were some software that could convert GameMaker scripts to like C++, I would be scared to use it.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the level generation and stuff like that, for example. The level generation was something that I could kind of port over pretty easily, and then build on. But with this Xbox game, I definitely needed someone to work with me on it, and so I was lucky that I'm friends with Andy, and at the time he was kind of between projects and looking for something, so he's doing most of the programming. He did all of the underlying engine programming, and most of the programming that I do is gameplay related.
Right.
I do all the programming for the levels and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't know. One is an Xbox project, so it's just a much larger scale thing where I've got to deal with. I've got to work with Andy. I've got to communicate a lot more with other people. I've got to communicate with the people on the team. I've got to talk with Microsoft, and so there's a little more. I've got to do marketing and stuff like that. There's a little more management, I guess, on my side. There's a little more communication. With the GameMaker version, I could, I put out a version. I would put out the first version that I released was not actually 1.0. It was like 0.8 or something like that. And I get feedback from people that played the game, and then I go back and kind of retool things and put out another version. But it was very off the cuff. It was very spontaneous. It's a very spontaneous way of development. With Xbox, I mean, you just can't work like that, obviously.
Right.
So it's requiring more communication, more discipline, I guess. There are just a lot more variables to think of, and it's just much more serious.
Yeah. In your opinion, how important is the community that forms around a new game? Like a new game comes out and there's all these players that kind of rise up around it. How important is that?
I think it's really important. I mean, I think the community that will... I don't know. I think the community that will actually come to your forums for your game and kind of just discuss the game with one another. I feel like that always seems like it's a very small group, like that hardcore group.
Yeah.
But they're for the small size, I think they're very important because they enjoy the game so much, they care about it so much, and they're your biggest proponents. I mean, they can also be your harshest critics, but it's important. I mean, not just for kind of getting the word out about the game, because that was instrumental to the Spelunky becoming popular and becoming, I mean, even like becoming an Xbox title. Like I don't think, I'm not sure it would have, I'm not sure how feasible it would have been to get Microsoft on board with Spelunky if there wasn't so much, people didn't, if there wasn't so much buzz about it on the internet from players who enjoyed the game. So, like whether they form as like a strong community or whether they're just individual fans. I mean, fans of your games are extremely important. And with Spelunky, they were the ones who made it a success because it was just a free game that I just put out on the internet, and I was not planning on doing very much promotion. I really was just planning on putting it out because it was a fun hobbyist project for me. So, yeah, I mean, I think community is important. I think you want to pay close attention to what they're saying. I don't know. I think you want to do as much as you can to listen to them and to kind of cultivate, give them the opportunity to talk about your game and feel like you're there basically for them. And that's something you can do as an indie that is maybe harder to do sometimes in a big company. It's something I'm still trying to work on because, like I said, I get really focused on the game development aspect, and I have a tendency to push other things out of my head, other people's voices out of my head while I'm concentrating. But every time I go out there and actually do interface with the community, I always find it to be very helpful.
Yeah. There's always going to be negative comments, negative feedback on your games.
Yeah.
This is you can't get away from it. How do you deal, with negative comments or feedback about stuff you've done?
I try to just think about, there are a couple things for me. One, I try to think about my main goal. And my main goal is to finish a game that's good, that lives up to, what I wanted, what I expected. And I try to make that shine more brightly than anything else. That's like the sun for me, basically. And so when I think about it like that, hearing someone say something bad about the game or hearing someone criticize the game, all of a sudden their criticism becomes, I see it under that light. And when I see it under that light, whatever blunt language that they use or, however they phrase it, their criticism, I'm only thinking about the actual criticism and what is the underlying reason and how can I use this to improve my game. So for me, when I try to make everything within the context of making the game as good as it can be, and for that, criticism is great. Yeah. I mean, I mean, people will definitely just straight up insult you on the internet, and sometimes that's not that constructive.
Right.
But there can still be a reason for
Yeah.
it. You know, there's always a reason for that. I mean, if it's just something personal, if they don't like you, I mean, you ignore it, whatever. But in terms of criticism, whether the person criticizing is actually has the exact right idea down or not, I mean, it's your job as the game developer to figure out what the real cause and what the real problem and solution are. But to try to not have my feelings hurt, I think about it in that context. And then that's great because you can get good feedback from people who are assholes, basically. I mean, yeah, I remember in particular there was a guy with the original Spelunky who would just get so angry about the game. He'd just constantly tell me like what I needed to do to make the game. He just thought the game was too hard, and he would, I mean, he would get so upset that, I mean, he was bordering on just like screaming at my face,
Right.
basically. And he just straight up wanted me to make the game easier. And I think that's something that I've heard a lot about Spelunky because it's a pretty challenging game. So, you know, when I read his comments, I mean, you do have that instinct to just be like, okay, you know, screw you. You know, you're yelling at me
Right.
about this free game. You know, you start to get a little indignant, but then, you know what? He's really playing the game. Like, he really wants to enjoy the game, and I appreciate that. And I think he may have a valid point. Like, I'm gonna look into it.
Right.
I've played this game so much; it's a lot easier for me than it is for other people. I'm not communicating something. I must not be communicating something to them that I already understand implicitly by being the game developer. So, so you know, I looked into it, and I instead of just making the game easier, you know, I'd fix a little something here and fix a little something there, and eventually, you know, he's able to get through the game, and I was kind of able to solve his problem, you know, indirectly.
Yeah.
But I think it was good to hear from him that he thought the game was too hard, and because he was so forceful about it. I mean, I kind of don't want to encourage people to just yell at game developers, but
Yeah.
you know, don't insult game developers
Right.
because they will get indignant and turn away. But I think I respect that people get so passionate about the game.
Right.
So I think that was the one thing I wanted to mention was the you know, the contextualizing these criticisms in terms of what your real goal is. Is your goal to have like the best feelings in the world, or is it to finish the game, you know?
Right.
The second thing is just that, you know, I feel really fortunate to be making games for a living, and it's just, I try to remind myself, like, if people are giving me a hard time on the internet or whatever, that I'm lucky. I'm having a good time making games, and it's just, yeah, I understand people get crazy passionate about video games and stuff, and they say what they want. They don't think about it. And but within the context of trying to make the game as good as it can be, and within the context of me just enjoying what I'm doing, I think it's hard to feel too bad.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
So if you weren't a game developer, what do you think you might be doing instead?
I'm pretty sure that I would be a comic book artist. Like, I'm pretty sure I would be trying to make a comic book and get it published, because I actually did try to make one after I graduated from college. I actually made one issue of a comic book and I submitted it to Slave Labor Graphics, which is a kind of indie comics publisher, and they really liked the art, but they I guess it's kind of ironic, but they actually thought the story was too random. So, so I decided, whatever, I'm going to make a game that's random.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, I've always really loved comic books, and I think if I wasn't making games, that's the second thing I would be going after.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, Edmund tweeted recently that he had a comic that was rejected by slave labor.
Yeah.
Also before he became a game developer. So we were joking that, or he was joking that I guess getting rejected by slave labor is a good thing for game developers,
games, yeah.
right? But yeah, I'd definitely be making a go of it as a comic book artist. And I've had a couple comics, like short comics, published in anthologies since. So.
What advice would you give to people who want to get started making their own video games?
First things first, make games. I think it's the best way to learn how to make them. I've never taken any game design courses or specifically game programming classes, so I can't really speak much to them. I've heard very mixed things about them. I know people that have gone to like DigiPen and they're doing great now, and I've heard people that have just had really bad experiences where it just wasn't at all what they expected, and they didn't get to make games as much as they thought they would. But I would say, before you even consider going to one of those schools for games, that you just try to make a game yourself, because you can. The tools are there. Whether you want to use something like Game Maker, which is very simple, or whether you want to just learn programming, the resources are there. There are people that you can talk to. It's a great way to test your mettle and as a game developer, to just make it. And then if you finish a game, that's something. There's nothing better to see in your resume than a finished game, and I think that's true no matter what part of game development you want to go into, like what role you want to eventually play. You want to be a designer, a programmer, an artist. I think in a lot of studios, like it's a big bonus if you at least understand like all the aspects of the game development, and you're not just like a pure artist. I mean, there are a lot of great stories from the id Software and the making of Doom and their story and stuff like that. So I bring those up a lot. But another one that this question makes me think of is just the 4,000 by 4,000 pixel arrowhead texture, which is kind of like at Ion Storm when John Romero was working on Daikatana. He hired artists who were from the comic book industry, but they didn't know a lot about games. So I guess it's this funny story where they were, I guess someone asked for a texture for this tiny arrowhead, and the artist like gave them this 4,000 by 4,000 pixel illustration, basically. Yeah. So, yeah, I think no matter what, no matter what you want to do, definitely if you want to be an indie and do a lot of the work yourself, for sure you want to make a game. You want to just try making a game on your own, and see if you can finish. And like I said before, finishing, I treat it as a skill and as a talent, and you want to see if you have that talent, if you have what it takes to put up with the style of development that indies do, because you might not be in a big team with a lot of people, so that's something that you really enjoy, like socializing with people, with lots of people all the time. That's something to consider, and you may want to try it out first, you know. But I think no matter what, whether you want to work on a small team or a big team, whether you want to work as a designer, programmer, artist, writer, anything else, it does not hurt to just try to make a game. It really is the best way to learn. You have to know how these pieces fit together, even if you're just working on one of those pieces.
Yeah. Finally, if you had to sum up game design and development in just one word, what one word would you choose?
So, I would choose the word flow. Because I think you want your game to have a flow. And I think you want your game development to have a flow. I think you want things to move in one direction and not be pulled in different directions. And I think it's an important thing for life, and it's an important thing for game development. It's an important thing for game design. Like how good the player's game experience is going to be is if there's flow, where they feel like every part of the game is working towards one thing. As a game developer, you know, in terms of the actual development, I want to make sure that everything I'm doing is working together. I mean, I don't want to ever feel like I'm being pulled in a direction opposite to me making a great game. And I think, and that touches on all kinds of things. I think it touches on who you're working with, you know, who you're around, who's not involved in the game. Are they supporting this direction that you're going in, or are they pulling you away? You know, I feel lucky because one of the reasons why I feel so lucky is because I have people around me that are supporting me in what I do, and it's a very different thing from what a lot of people do. And my job, I'm spending so much time like in front of my computer screen working on games and thinking, and when I'm not doing that, I'm thinking about them. Right. You know, so yeah, flow is really important, and that's my word. That's my mantra.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Derek, for talking to us. It's been great.
Thanks.
Really
yeah,
appreciate it.
It was fun.